For tonight, Torah portion Emor, as I wrote in my Shabbat thought, is the most detailed list of our Jewish holy days. And there was a time when I would teach the holy days in great detail. Since we moved online, many things I used to do I stopped doing, and it occurs to me I may want to start doing this again. So this is something that I want to share, remind the veterans and share to all of our newcomers in the past few years. And that is what I call the 5 radii of Jewish spirituality. I can make it 4, I can make it 6, but I like 5. We have the 5 books of the Torah, etc. I'll list them, and then I want to make a brief comment about number 5. So when I think of Jewish spirituality, and by that I mean attention to the life of the Spirit. Now, for me, the spiritual life is a little bit different from the moral life. The moral life, taking the word moral seriously, really has to do with our obligations to other people, our duties to others. You could call the spiritual life also the moral duties to the self. Many moral philosophers question that idea. So I'm going to call them spiritual duties, which have to do with a discipline of insight, contemplation, reflection, character, etc. So one of the radii of Jewish spirituality, radii meaning they radiate out from a center, is what I'm going to call the inner life contemplative transformative dimension. I'll call that number 1. And I'm going to list them serially, meaning if you can do number 1, it's more likely you can do numbers 2 and 3. And you can put these in the order that you like. I'll say number 2 will be the spiritual study of Torah. I remember when I was a younger kid in confirmation, it was the Torah was a book of laws and stories. I grew up in a conservative congregation, but even there it had a rather dismissive attitude toward the Torah, meaning the miracles didn't really happen. The stories had an almost Aesop's fable quality to them. No one ever taught me what the archetypal study of Torah meant. I never heard these terms until I was, after high school, introduced to Jung and Hillman, especially the idea of archetypal psychology, which I really learned from a very good friend that I had back in those days who was a deep student of Hillman. One person introduced me to James Hillman's the book In Search. It's a transformative book for me. Another person recommended Hillman's Revisioning Psychology, another foundational transformative book for me. And I understood that the inner life is populated by archetypes, and that the biblical characters, the biblical themes, certain words in the Bible, these name archetypal events of the soul. Hillman says the soul is where events become experiences. So the soul, as I've shared with you many times, is always at work, always listening, always experiencing. We're just not aware of it. In a way, we are asleep to the journey and the world of the soul. There's a way to study Torah. When you study the words, the metaphors, the symbols, the characters deeply, it awakens something in the soul. So you realize we have an archetypal, each of us, Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Joseph, Judah, Moses, Aaron. These are archetypal characters. We also have archetypal moments. As I shared before, I'm doing an extensive, deep study looking at many sources as I can of the first few lines of Genesis. I want you to think for a moment the Hebrew word bara, which means create. In the PL form, for you Hebrew grammarians, levareh means to clear out a forest. So try to imagine the first line of Genesis is, in the beginnings of God clearing out the heavens and the earth. And the earth was tohu vavohu. What does that word mean? I recommend it. Go look at Isaiah chapter 34. Go look at Jeremiah chapter 4. And you'll find that tohu vavohu means something like the landscape of the earth is reflecting an inner spiritual chaos and disorder. So the term comes from the prophetic priestly tradition, which tells us that the first lines of Genesis were composed much later than the stories as a preface to the entire Torah. I believe, composed by Jeremiah or the Jeremiah school, as introducing the ideal of the human condition, and then chapter 2 of Genesis, you might say the beginning of the fall of the human condition, and Genesis chapter 3 describing in many ways the exile of the human condition. So you read the preface, you read 2, 3, 4, and then you reflect on yourself. I mean, this is what I would call archetypal. Do I have a vision for myself? An intact vision for what I would be like, balancing the higher self and the so-called lower self, balancing light and darkness, an inner life that is integrated, an inner life that is connected. Can we all have a vision of that, what that would be like? Then you go to chapter 2 and you see the human being created out of the dust of the earth. And then chapter 3, what happens when the human being is placed in the so-called garden of delight, the garden of pleasure, and falls susceptible to the to the words of the Nachash. To break the only law that they had was to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So look at that as an archetypal journey of yourself. By the way, earlier today, I gave a speak at De Toledo High School. I was asked to speak to the high school seniors who did a so-called capstone project to provide a capstone of their work at the high school. And I was one of a series of speakers. I recorded it, so I think we're putting a link in the chat and I put up on YouTube with the students' permission, by the way. I spoke about moral realism. I spoke about the basics of comportment in loving relationships, really engaging discussion with the students. But I wanted them to take this archetypal journey, that there really are better and worse answers to moral questions, and what does it mean that there's complexity in the world? So this idea that sometimes we live in tohu vavohu, we live in unbearable complexity. And so some of the students said, since there's so much complexity, there can't be better and worse answers to moral questions, because if there were, everybody would agree. So I shared with the students, maybe not as gently as I could, that's a fallacy. The fact that people disagree does not mean there are not better and worse answers. For me, it means that people just don't think well, that they don't reason well. As the English moral philosophic tradition, going from Francis Bacon down to Isaac Watts and others, there are many reasons why we don't think well. By the way, if you want to see a catalog of why we don't think well, I know you've all heard of Francis Bacon. Go look Francis Bacon up. It's in the public domain. Go look up Isaac Watts. You will not read better philosophers about why human beings don't think well, why we're stuck in tohu vavohu, unformed chaos, and how we can livareh, how can we clear out the inner life, and as it were, that in our inner life, as we mivareh, as we clear out the inner life, we become like the divine livro, to create light from darkness. It's a beautiful, complex thought. What I'm trying to share with you is just reading the stories of creation. Those are archetypal events. So the second of the radii is the spiritual study of Torah. The third of the radii is something that's very difficult for many people, is the life of the Siddur. Now, as you know, for me, the Siddur is a chain of beautiful poetic gems. I didn't know this until I was able, A, how to read poetry, and B, slow down and read every gem of the prayer book. And I saw it's like a necklace of gems, one gem after the other. So it wasn't until my Hebrew was relatively fluent and I decided to translate every line of the prayer book for myself that I discovered the poetry. So one of the radii is a life of insight. The second, you might say, the spiritual study of Torah. The third is the gems of the Siddur. For our purpose, I'll say the fourth is how spirituality connects to the body, especially the Talit. I won't do the entire teaching. Many of you heard it. For those who haven't, I'll teach it again. And I'll say number 5 is the sacred calendar. So for me, the the sacred calendar. And again, I didn't know this. I didn't understand until I began reading the Hasidic masters that every holiday had a depth connected to the next holiday. So let's think of the time we're in right now. And I'll try to bring this to a close. When we study Passover deeply, including the antecedent days, there's a very deep understanding of the inner Pharaoh, of the idea of the spiritual shortness of breath, inner chains, lack of inner liberation. And one thing I realized when I was studying this is many people had high-sounding phrases. I mean, I've heard the idea of inner slavery, the inner Pharaoh, but I never heard anybody talk about exactly what you do about it. I mean, exactly. What do you do about the inner sense of exile? And I realized there has to be a technology of transformation. So one thing that Passover was for me was not only learning all the beautiful metaphors and symbols, but actually mastering the technology of transformation and what it means to be on a transformative journey. Now that leads you right to the holiday of Shavuot, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, which is if you, again, this is the metaphor of the tradition, if you do enough of this work, referring back to our poem, you suddenly hear truth knocking at the door. That's what I'll call the analog or the metaphor of Shavuot. We're at Mount Sinai, and truth descends onto the mountain. The truth speaks out to all of us, but what do we hear from the ensuing narratives? Is that we couldn't hear. Instead of listening to the voice of truth, we built a molten calf, which leads us to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot. It's such an incredible journey. I didn't understand the journey from Passover to Shavuot, to Tisha B'Av, to Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, to Sukkot, this incredibly deep journey until I was able to study Hasidic literature. And then I discovered in rabbinic literature that they saw it as an inner process. They saw it as a transformative journey. So what you need to do is study each of the holidays in its powerful symbolic transformative dimension, link it to the next holy day, link it to the next holy day, to the next one, to the next one, and through the observance of the holiday and the study of the holiday, you go on an incredible journey. I'm not including here Hanukkah and the others, just this one season from Pesach to Sukkot. And then, of course, you live through the other holidays, and when you arrive at the next Pesach, you're not the person you were the year before. I mean, this is one thing that when I look at my notes and the Bibles that I've stored, I look at my comments, and I remember one year thinking, what a callow young man, that was the best he could do as far as his comment. Well, last year I was still maybe not a young man, but comparative to what it means to go through another year, not understanding. So every single year that we take this journey, in my opinion, if we take the journey correctly, it's transformative, and we're not the same person the next year. That has been my aim. That's my, as it were, purpose in observing these holidays, and I have to say, it really, really does work. Sometimes people ask me, do I write my high holiday sermons? I remember being taught in rabbinical school, if you don't write your sermon out, you're not respecting your congregation. And I thought to myself, if I wrote my sermon out, I'm not respecting my congregation. Because how do I know on, let's say, Yom Kippur Eve, what I'm going to think tomorrow on Yom Kippur Day if I haven't gone through Yom Kippur Eve? That's why you see that I, in general, memorize what I have to say, refurbish it constantly. I don't speak from notes, because if I prepared notes, I wouldn't mean it an hour later. It has to be real now. Well, I got this from the Hasidic tradition, that you have to say Torah as it appears in the heart, and every holiday is another opportunity to, as it were, say Torah. So what I wrote in my Shabbat thought is, how does one prepare oneself for this fifth, if the first is the contemplative practice, the second is a spiritual study of Torah, the third is the intentional engagement with the prayer book, the fourth is the bodily dimension, for example, the talit. If number 5 is the practice of the sacred calendar, the thing I realized is, if you start observing your own personal sacred calendar, it helps us understand the communal sacred calendar better. Meaning, if you are not engaged in a life of accepting the mystery, knowing when you're having those incredible moments of synchronicity, when the universe seems to be speaking to you in a coded language that you have to decipher, if you're not open to those if those moments yourself, then we're not trained, as it were, to listen to the moments of the community. I just want to give you one very brief example. I'm very open to these moments, meaning even as I drive down the street, in addition to trying to be a good driver, suddenly back in the day, I would see a bookstore, and I would say, "There's something in there," and I would turn in, park, go around. It's almost as if I would wait for the book to greet me, to come off the shelf. I'm just about positive that one thing is a common denominator for everybody here tonight. You've had that moments when you know something is going to speak to you. You don't look for the book, you wait for the book to find you. And there'd be that moment. Still have many of those books. Some of my favorite books of poetry, by the way. And I open the book and I find the poem, including Stephen Crane's "The Man Spoke to the Universe" that I've been reciting since I was in my early 20s. Well, that was a book. I went into McDonald's bookstore down in Long Beach, a warehouse of books. I thought, I'm going to go in there and wait for the book to find me, which it did. And I've been reciting from that book ever since. So what I want to say to all of us here is I think one thing that we share in common, by definition, being part of the Oratora community, is we know that the universe, God, the universe, whatever you want to call it, sparkles and speaks to us. And if one puts oneself in that receptive dimension, sometimes it's not speaking. And we have to work diligently and assiduously to find openings. And then one moment, it just, the universe just sparkles. And the best we can do is absorb it. I would say memorize time and place, understand the meaning of it, put it into your calendar of personal holidays, and try to remember it every year, every season of your life. There were times I wish I would have memorized the season, really transformative events I can remember vividly. I remember the year it happened. I just don't remember the month, and I really wish I did. So part of what I'm saying to all of us is, let's populate our personal calendars with those moments. Let's bring them up to memory. Can you list, by a certain age, your 20 most transformative moments, where you were, what you felt, what you saw, what the message is? Have you locked it down? And I'm thinking about Shanti or someone else just said, the way I want to be remembered when I pass from this world. Can we share those moments with another person who will succeed us? And they can say, here's what that person was like. This was their sacred calendar. So if you have that inner sacred calendar, I truly hope someone loves you enough to listen to your sacred calendar, to memorize those moments so that when we're gone, that's one thing that they will take as a memory for us of how we engaged with the sacred. Right.